Well, it's great to be with you all. And like Andreas said, this morning we're going to continue this overall theme that we've been covering of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And what I appreciate about this theme is that the experiences of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when taken together, are actually the experiences that we as believers should go through. And so each week we're going to dive into specific experiences that each Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob went through. But those things that they went through are actually applicable, real experiences that we should also be going through in our Christian life. And so I really hope that as we go through this, in addition to gaining a lot more knowledge and familiarity with the Bible and the verses and stories in it, I hope that we'll also get some practical applications to help us advance in our Christian life. And this morning we come to this topic, Abraham, the seed for the fulfillment of God's purpose. And I thought that's kind of an interesting topic to be sharing to some college students. So I thought maybe we could break the title down a little bit, focusing a little bit on God's purpose, and then also a large portion on the seed and what is the seed and things of that nature. And so starting with God's purpose, in any kind of writing, the opening portion of that writing is a very important component of the overall piece. And when we look at the Bible, God makes very clearly at the very beginning of the very beginning of the Bible what his purpose is, and he does that in the verse Genesis 1:26. And I wonder if we could pull that up on the screen. I'll read it for everyone just so we have it, but it's the first verse here on our screen, and it says, "And God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of heaven, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So here in the very beginning of the Bible, which book encompasses a long period of time and 66 books and thousands of pages, at the very beginning, God makes it very clear that his desire is that he would make mankind in his image, according to his likeness, and that this man would have dominion over the earth. And when we break down these words, image, that word refers to God's inner being, the expression of his attributes. So what is he as a person? And those attributes are primarily love, light, holiness, righteousness, things of that nature. So he made man that man would express these attributes. And he also made man in his likeness. That's his form, that's his outward expression, his body. So our physical body is somewhat of a representation of God's. And then he also made man that not only that we would have God's image and likeness, but that we would have dominion. And that dominion is to subdue God's enemy, to recover the earth, and to bring in God's kingdom to the earth. And so simply put, as seen early in the Bible, God's purpose is that man would express him with his image and represent him with his dominion. So that's a little bit on God's purpose. So then we come to the seed. What is the seed, and how does that relate to God's purpose? Well, in the book of Genesis, it's primarily broken into three sections. The first one is creation, which we just kind of touched on. The second is fall, man's fall. It starts with where Satan tempted Adam and Eve in the garden, and then it actually continues. Man falls even further from that. To eventually, the third section is what's called God's calling. He basically starts to call a people out of that very fallen condition. And that's really where Abraham starts. And so Abraham was the first person called by God out of a very pitiful and fallen situation. And it's in this section of Genesis, the section on calling, that we see this concept of the seed enter into the Bible. And so before getting into what the seed means, I think we want to kind of break the word down a little bit and understand its meaning in this context. Of course, the word seed has a lot of meanings. it could very easily be interpreted in this context as descendants or children or things of that nature, which to some extent it does. But the word seed also means or can imply a capsule of life within a shell. And that life that's contained in the shell has the full capacity to reproduce and bring forth a mature and new life. So it's important to consider as we're looking at this, the Bible doesn't use the word children in this passage. It uses the word seed, singular. And that's very important because it tells us a few things. One is a seed is usually small. It's not often you see a lot of very massive seeds kind of running around. Usually seeds are pretty small in nature. Even seeds that grow into large trees or things like that, they tend to be small. A seed is a container of life. A seed needs to be sown into something. And when that small seed that contains life is sown into something, that issues an outgrowth and multiplication of the life that was contained in that seed. So as we get into these verses here, and maybe Chris, you could pull them up in Genesis 12 and 13 and 15. When we start talking about the seed in relation to Abraham, we want to think about these things as a container of life that's going to be sown into something, and out from that sowing is going to issue a multiplication and growth of that life. So here in Genesis 12, it says these verses here in Genesis 12 and Genesis 13 and Genesis 15 are three different appearings by God to Abraham, telling Abraham that he's going to give him a seed. I'll just read the first one, and since these verses are kind of long, we'll leave them up there for everyone else to read. But the first one says, "And Jehovah appeared to Abram and said, 'To your seed I will give this land.' And there he built an altar to Jehovah who had appeared to him." Actually, you know what? I'll just continue to read these. The next section says, "For all the land you see, I will give to you and to your seed forever. And I will make your seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then your seed can also be numbered." Genesis 15, "And Abram said, 'O Lord Jehovah, what will you give me? For I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus.' And Abram said, 'Since you have given me no seed, therefore a servant in my house is my heir.' But then the word of Jehovah came to him, saying, 'This man shall not be your heir, but he who will come out from your own body shall be your heir.' And he brought him outside and said, Look now toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them.' And he said to him, 'So shall your seed be.' And he being Abraham, believed Jehovah, and he, being Jehovah, accounted it to him as righteousness." So these are the three sort of progressive appearings that God gave to Abraham concerning his seed. And we're going to dwell on these, but before dwelling on Abraham's experience in these verses, I want to continue the thought of the seed briefly throughout the Bible so we can see how it specifically applies to us. So the way the Bible continues on from this passage is that Abraham and his wife Sarah ultimately do give birth to a son named Isaac in their old age, and this son was God's promise to Abraham that he would have a seed. And Isaac went on to have a son named Jacob, and Jacob went through many experiences, and God changed his name to Israel. And then Jacob had many sons, and those sons began to multiply, and eventually a large group of people was developed, and they were known as the children of Israel. They were held in captivity within Egypt, and eventually God, through a man named Moses, called them out of Egypt to lead them through the wilderness into the good land, which is Israel, that God had promised Abraham's seed. And eventually, after hundreds of years, Jesus Christ is born of a virgin, but through the people, the Hebrew people, the Jewish people that are the children of Abraham, following that lineage all the way to the birth of Christ. And Christ lived on the earth for 33 and a half years. He lived a perfect human life. He was crucified at the end of those 3 and a half years, and bore all the sins of the entire world on the cross when he died for us. And in so doing, he redeemed us and he purchased us. And not only so, he resurrected. And when he resurrected from his death, he became what's called the life-giving Spirit. And through this transformation, this seed of Abraham that was once a large group of people, but then became a God-man in the man Jesus, through this process of Jesus living on the earth, dying on the cross, resurrecting and becoming the life-giving Spirit, now this seed had been transformed into a spirit form in which any human being on the earth that believes into God can receive him. And so as we go to, as the story continues on through the Bible, eventually in John chapter 20, after the Lord resurrected, he breathed himself into the apostles, and the life-giving Spirit entered other humans for the first time. And from that time, as people began to increasingly believe in the Lord, this life was spread and multiplied. This life of God ultimately did. And as we go to these verses, Chris, if you could bring up Galatians 3, 7, and 16, we'll see how the Bible now defines the sons of Abraham. Galatians 3, 7 says, "Know then that they who are of faith, these are the sons of Abraham." Galatians 3:16 also says, "But to Abraham were the promises spoken, and to his seed. He does not say, and to the seeds as concerning many, but as concerning one, and to your seed, who is Christ." And Galatians 3:29, "And if you are of Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to promise." So following this thought through, if we read Galatians 3:29, if we are those who have believed in Christ and we are of Christ, we are now actually Abraham's seed. So as we're looking at this title today, the seed for the fulfillment of God's purpose, this isn't just a title taken from a small story within the Old Testament that took place 4,000 years ago, but this is actually a title that very much concerns us in that we are the seed of Abraham and we have a role in the fulfillment of God's eternal purpose. So if we go, I wanted to share that. I know that's kind of a long sort of synopsis of the Bible, or portions of it, but I wanted to share that so that we understand this is not just a historical story, but this is actually something that very much pertains to us, because we, through the life of Christ, have become the seeds of Abraham. And so when we look to the story here of Abraham, we can see that his experience that he went through in God producing this seed in him for the ultimate fulfillment of God's purpose is actually something that we should experience today. So when we look at Abraham's experience, Abraham was appeared to by God, and God spoke to him about having a seed in chapters 12, 13, and 15, like we reviewed. And many times when we come to these verses, Chris, if you could scroll up just a little bit to go back to those verses in Genesis. Thank you. If we look at this last section here, so where it says, "And he believed Jehovah, and he accounted it to him as righteousness." Many times we can interpret that is actually the belief of salvation. But we have to look at this according to the word. And actually, what Abraham in this context was already one who believed in God. God had appeared to him in Chaldea, and he left his family, he left his father, he left his brother. God appeared to him and saved him from kings who were looking to take his life. God provided food and drink for him to sustain his life. Abraham very much knew and believed in God. And so this belief here actually is a much deeper belief. And in the same way with us, most, if not all of us here, we're already saved. And so the believing that is accounted to us as righteousness, what is this kind of belief? This is a deeper belief than just our salvation. And what Abraham's belief here was that God would wrought something into him in his old age to produce a seed that would ultimately fulfill God's purpose. And this was very hard for Abraham to believe, because Abraham was old and Abraham's wife was old. So just biologically, he didn't understand how God would do that when God initially spoke to him about that. So that's why you can even see in these verses in chapter 15, Abraham answers God and says, oh, it's going to be, you must be referring to Eliezer, because I'm too old to have a son, and Eliezer is really the only thing I have. So it must be Eliezer that's going to be your seed. But God told him, no, it's going to be through you. And eventually, Abraham just had to believe Jehovah. And it was through his belief that God would work a seed into Abraham and produce a child through his wife, Sarah. That was what was accounted to him as righteousness, because Abraham didn't understand how it would happen, but he simply believed. So this is a deeper believing that we as Christians today can enter into for the fulfillment of God's purpose. And so as we look at today's situation, as college students on campus, we're in the midst of a pandemic. We're in the midst of wild political and societal upheaval. We're doing remote schooling. Futures are uncertain. It'd be very easy and normal and not bad for us to pray for these things to pass, and to pray for these for the Lord to care for our well-being, which he does. But what really needs to be taking place in us is that God needs to be adding more and more of himself into us. And it's through that addition of himself into us that he can carry out his purpose in each one of us. And the more he adds himself into us, the more we begin to express him and represent him, similar to what Genesis 1:26 talked about and God's purpose for man. And so I as I was considering this, I just appreciated how is this done? How do we as believers get infused more with God and get infused more with this faith, which God counts as righteousness? And that really is through the appearing of God. And where does God appear to us? That's in the meetings of the church. That's when we read the word. That's when we touch him in our spirit. And, I can testify so many times I'll be in a meeting and I'll just think, oh, I can't make it. I can't be a good Christian. I can't fulfill God's purpose. But actually, as words are spoken in that meeting, faith is infused into me. And I realize, yes, I can't. I don't need to make it. I don't need to be like Abraham, who tries to produce an Eliezer or who tries to figure it out on my own. I need more of God's appearing. I need more of God's infusing. And as God infuses himself into us, we begin to represent him. We begin to express him. Suddenly, our love begins to look a lot like his love. And our temperament begins to look a lot more like his temperament. And this is how we can begin to play a role in God's purpose on the earth today. And so, brothers and sisters, I just appreciate, when we come to this this topic of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we're going to see tremendous stories for each one of these people. But each one of these stories that they go through are directly applicable to us in our Christian life, and are things that we really want to make sure we lay hold of and that we go through so that we can go on in our Christian life. And I would specifically say that in today's environment where the world is just really kind of a hopeless place, this is all the more the time that we need to hold on to the things of God. And I just was so appreciative this morning as I was studying these things, that in a world full of turmoil, when the future is uncertain and the outlook is kind of bleak, I'm so thankful that I know that I have a God, and I know that God died for me, and I know that he has a role for me in his eternal purpose. And that gives my life so much meaning in a time when life can feel quite meaningless and pointless, because the future is uncertain and not the best. And saints, this is actually a unique opportunity for us. Sometimes when the environment is uncertain and things are harder, that's when we can really touch what really matters. And in this pandemic and where we are in the world, now is a wonderful time for us to really take stock, take inventory of our Christian life, and focus on what really matters. And I just appreciate this practical application that we can go to the meetings of the church and we can touch God in his word. And through those appearings that take place in these settings, God transfuses more faith into us. And that faith is Christ being wrought into us, into our being. And that is how God can carry out his purpose in us and through us.